The FDA's Prescription Drug User Fee Program, or PDUFA, was started in 1992. Through the 80s and into the early 90s, there were concerns that patients in other countries were getting access to new therapies before patients in America. And one of the big bottlenecks was actually the review time at FDA. And it's hard for us to believe, I think, today, that it used to take sometimes years to get a product reviewed by the FDA after they submitted all of the data. And so Congress and FDA worked together to come up with a new scheme that would provide the agency with additional funding and additional resources to help product review in exchange for a commitment from the agency to actually review applications in a certain amount of time. Throughout the years, every 5 years, we keep reauthorizing the Prescription Drug User Fee Program because it was so successful in holding FDA accountable to both reviewing applications on time, having meetings with drug sponsors and patient groups, and really improving the interaction between the FDA and the sector it regulated and the sector that is impacted by the development of these products, namely patients. So the user fee program has a few different parts. First is what we think about on the Hill, for those of us who are DC focused, is the actual legislation, changing the law. But the real core of the prescription drug user fee program is the commitment letter. And what the commitment letter is an agreement between FDA and industry about what the extra funds will be used for and what both sides agree to do. And so these folks sit down at the beginning of every cycle and come up with that agreement. Next slide. So they sit down at the table about 2 years before a reauthorization is needed. So in this case, we need to reauthorize the user fees by September 30th, 2022, so a couple months away. They started back in the fall of 2020. And they sat down and said, okay, what is working really well? What might need to be improved going forward? And as part of that process, it's not just industry and FDA in the room, but there is a public feedback process where the FDA will hold public meetings. There will be comment periods that folks can contribute their suggestions and thoughts and what the PDUFA letter should include. And there's also a chance sort of at the end of the process for stakeholder comments. All of that was happening through the fall of 2020 and into the beginning of 2021. There was a big public meeting in the summer of 2021 to discuss that. And then the commitment letter was formally, they call it, transmitted to Congress. Email now, used to be paper. I think it might still be paper as well, but that sort of formally goes to Congress in January. And so that letter is really powerful. It started out sort of in the 90s being pretty narrow. It was just, how long does it take to review an application? How long does it take to respond to a meeting request? Where today, for PDUFA 7, the commitment letter is over 70 pages long. And it does a few things. Besides just setting sort of how much the agency gets paid and how, exactly the timeline for those things, it outlines certain sort of goals that they want the agency to do. That can include updating guidance. That can include holding public meetings or workshops. It could be, launching pilot programs. So there's a lot in there that FDA can do based on its current authorities. What it can't do is actually change the law in any way. So in the commitment letter process, they can't go in and say, oh, FDA needs new authority, or we need to change the rules of the road per the law. That's Congress's job. But because FDA's authorities are so flexible as currently written, there's a lot of new commitments that the industry and FDA can come up with. So process-wise, the user fee legislation, when that passes, it will incorporate this commitment letter sort of by reference. It says all of the money that you're going to get, all of these provisions, they link back to all of the goals that are written in this letter, which goes into the congressional record. The user fee legislation will also make a lot of changes to the individual sort of fiscal policies. So updating all of the calendar dates. So everything that used to be expires, at the end of 2022 will now expire at the end of the next cycle. They will update dollar amounts for inflation. They will update the way that the money flows, all of that nitty gritty, but all of that is contained within this sort of commitment letter. Next slide. So within this commitment letter, like I said, it is really robust, especially for things that I think the rare disease community will really care about. I talked about sort of policy, process, and sort of pilots earlier. So when we think about the new policy, it can't change the law, but it can really change how FDA focuses on certain topics. And so within this PDUFA cycle, there is going to be an enhanced focus on how do we use novel clinical trial designs, which are especially important when we have small trial populations. FDA is going to start meeting earlier with drug sponsors on designing surrogate endpoints. And there's actually a pilot program to also support the advancement of these surrogate endpoints and making sure that we have a better understanding of surrogate endpoints at the beginning of trials, understanding how they can support approval later on. There's also a big focus on embracing new technology. I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, we all embraced the technologies of Zoom and Teams and all of these different approaches. FDA actually did too. FDA sort of went remote, and they found out that when clinical trials had to go remote too, and people had to use the technology that we have in sort of the 2020s, they could still get really good trial results. They could still get that data. And so the commitment letter spends a lot of time contemplating how to really take digital technologies and have those deployed into clinical trials. And how do we embrace, whether it's remote monitoring or whether it's sort of a digital data collection, how we can deploy those to make clinical trials easier to participate in. For those, anyone on the phone who's participated in a clinical trial, it is a lot of work. It's very difficult sometimes to get to clinical trial sites. It's demanding on the patients and the caregivers' time to do so. And so if we can start to embrace technology more in trials, we can get more people enrolled in trials, and we can actually get more data more quickly. So we can advance therapy. So a lot of focus here on embracing what happened during COVID and advancing these digital technologies and how we collect evidence. The other things I would note, probably a little wonkier and sort of drug development specific, but FDA is going to be looking at how they review applications, if they can start to do, rolling review as folks collect data for supplement applications. There's going to be an increased focus on chemistry and manufacturing controls. Any of you who might be thinking or focused on the gene therapy space, chemistry manufacturing controls, or CMC, has been an increasing bottleneck in the development of gene therapies. Because gene therapies are sort of living, breathing entities, a lot of times, actually derived from patients' own cells or are produced in a lab from patient starting materials. The manufacturing is really different. And we are thinking about how we can get the regulatory system to move along with the advancements in science to really understand the natural variability in that manufacturing, so that we can actually advance those applications and wrap our regulatory minds around what does regulation of manufacturing look like going into the 21st century. Next slide. So there's all these great things in the PDUFA letter that are important to both the companies and to patients, but we also need to actually advance a bill through Congress, which I think is why we're talking about this in May 2022. So as I mentioned, this whole process of getting the reauthorizations done, making all those date changes in law, plus incorporating this PDUFA letter by reference, that all must be wrapped up by September 30th of this year. The two committees leading this work are, on the Senate side, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and on the House side, the Energy and Commerce Committee. The legislation has always been bipartisan. Every year, even with the partisan fights going on, they've always found a way to sort of do this in a way that is sort of standalone, that is not one of these big giant omnibus packages, but to just advance the user fee negotiation or the user fee agreements. And they've done that in a really bipartisan way with big votes out of both chambers. Obviously, we don't know exactly what the floor process is going to be this year, but the committees are making a lot of really good progress. Just last week, the Energy and Commerce Committee passed the Food and Drug Act of 2022. That's what they've called their version of the PDUFA reauthorization. They passed that out of committee, and we are expecting a floor vote in early June. The Senate Help Committee put out a draft of their bill. They sort of stuck to the five or six letter acronym approach. So they named theirs the FDA Safety and Landmark Advancement Act, or FDASLA. FDASLA. We've been thinking it sounds sort of glittery and dazzly, but they advanced that, and they're looking to try and mark that up in early June. So eventually, the two sides of the Capitol have to come together on what this process looks like. But as you all know, they don't just like to change dates and incorporate letters by reference. They like to legislate. They like to change the law and do things that are important to their members. So this year, and I know Jamie and some of the other panelists are going to talk about these issues, they're looking at what we like to call riders, or what are the FDA policies that Congress also really wants to legislate on that's outside just the agreements. And so this year, we've been hearing a lot about accelerated approval, manufacturing processes, platforms, whether it's gene therapy platforms or platforms that can help with pandemics. I know Jamie will talk about the STAT Act as well, focusing on rare diseases. So that's a little bit of process and scope of what to expect. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists, and happy to take questions at the end on process.